Good morning, students. Now we are going to deal with Philip Sidney's apology for poetry. As you know, that Stephen Gosson had attacked on poetry, and he had put up four main charges against poetry. The first one is poetry is the waste of time. Poetry is mother of lies. It is a nurse of abuse, and Plato had rightly banished the poets from his ideal world. Right? Philip Sidney had defended these against the poetry against these charges of Stephen Gosson. Right? It's a kind of a similar attack and defense as you know you have already studied in between Plato and Aristotle. Plato in his Ideal Republic had certain allegations against poetry, and Aristotle in his uh, Poetics, apart from giving this theory of tragedy and other kind of poetry, uh, he had defended poetry against all those allegations. In a similar manner, Sidney has defended poetry against the allegations of Stephen Gosson. So the first one is that poetry is a source of is the waste of time. He says, Sidney says that poetry is a source of knowledge and a civilizing force. It is not a waste of time. Why? Because, as Stephen Gosson had said, that poetry corrupts the people. He says it's not the corruption, right? Because the best kind of learning is the learning which teaches and moves at the same time, which teaches and moves to virtue at the same time, right? And nothing can both teach and amuse as poetry does, right? So poetry, uh, unlike other kinds of disciplines which just teach or just amuse, right? It has an amalgamation of both teaching and amusing at the same time, right? So something which can provide you entertainment, pleasure, and can also be certain kind of didactic, certain kind of bring about teaching, right? So how can something which gives you both at the same time be a waste of time? I think the best kind of time that someone can devote is the poetry, reading poetry, because it can teach you and amuse you at the same time, right? So and this is precisely the reason that uh, it has been a main source of education, right? And see how Greek societies put up so much reverence on respected poets, right? And it's not the Greek society, but almost all the civilizations across the world had made the poet a reverend one, right? Now, looking at the second charge against poetry, uh, Philip Sidney, what Stephen Gosson said, that it's a mother of lies, right? So Sidney says that the poet does not lie, right? Why? Because he never affirms that his fiction is true and can never lie, right? He does not indulge in writing about individual facts like history, right? That as history talks about the individual facts, right, what happened on a particular date, time, or a particular king or an event, poetry never talks about an event. Poetry never talks about a kind of point of time. It never talks about individual facts, rather, but does not mean it doesn't it indulges in certain kind of fiction. It talks about higher kind of reality. It talks about ideal and universal reality, right? Reality which may not be applicable to an individual, but reality which is applicable to a larger individuals as such. Therefore, poetry cannot be mother of lies. Rather, poetry talks about higher form of truth, a higher kind of reality, right? Now, coming to the next, that so, in this way, Sidney has rejected that poetry is the source of abuse. For him, it is people who abuse poetry, not the vice versa, right? Abuses are more nursed by philosophy and history than by poetry, by describing battles, bloodshed, violence, etc. On the contrary, poetry helps to maintain morality and peace by avoiding such violence and bloodshed, right? Uh, Moreover, it brings light to knowledge, right? So, if there have been certain poets whose wits may have abused poetry, does it mean that poetry is abusing the wits of people, right? Coming to the next charge, that Plato, in his Republic, wanted to banish the abuse of poetry, not the poets. That simply means that Plato never was against the poets but abuse of poetry, right? So there in Plato's time there have been certain kinds of poets who have been indulged in abusing poetry, who were not producing anything new, who were not producing anything novel, who have just been indulged in repetition and following Homer and other kind of writers, right? So he was against such kind of abuse of poetry, not the poets themselves, right? In fact, he was himself poetical. Plato was himself poetical, which we can find in his dialogues. Plato never says that all poets should be banished. He called for banishing only those poets who are inferior and unable to instruct the children and the citizens of the states. For Sidney, art is the imitation of nature, but it is not slavish imitation as Plato views. Rather, it is creative imitation. Nature is dull, incomplete, and ugly. It is artists who turn dull nature into golden color. He employs his creative faculty, imagination, and style of presentation to decorate the raw material of nature. For Sidney, art is a speaking picture having spatio-temporal dimension. For Aristotle, human action is more important, but for Sidney, nature is important. Right? So artists are to create arts considering the level of readers. The only purpose of art is to teach and delight, like the whole tendency of Renaissance. Sidney favors poetic justice that is possible in poets' world where good are rewarded and wicked people are punished. Right? Hence, thus, Sidney defines all the charges against poetry and stands for the sake of universal and timeless quality of poetry, making us know why the poets are universal genius. Best wishes. Thank you.